which is the review of golf course financing options. Mr. Gingrich.
So I'm here for any questions. I sent out that package from last meeting.
So Mr. Gingrich is only here for any questions. He's not going to make any presentation. He's here for questions. So does any member of the committee, Finance Committee, have any questions regarding the materials that he submitted to us in the package? Take a minute and find it. Councilor McGinn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, just a general question. Any in-house loan for the full amount to basically swap out the existing debt service and would draw down the reserve, correct? We obviously we can't count that in two places. So,
That's correct.
So I just want everybody to be clear on that. The amounts here are significant. So I think although Councilor Gravel kind of spelled out a scenario that has perhaps a lot of desirable attributes, the effect of taking the full amount would in fact bring down the reserve. And I know we just talked about this. I believe it was you, Councilor Turco, that asked some probing questions at the tax classification hearing about the size of the reserve and so forth and where we would stand. And so anything we do here will bring down that number. And to that end, it appears to me that if there is an option that we should look at, it's probably the third one, I believe, that was spelled out, which would basically be kind of a contingency loan on a smaller scale, if needed, to address any capital issues or capital expenditures that maybe have been deferred, or if there is anticipated to be a cash flow issue that would cause us to draw down retained earnings further than we might want to otherwise do. So that would be my thought, Mr. President. Thank you.
Councilor Gould.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good evening, Mike.
Good evening.
So, Mike, to summarize, scenario one is don't change anything?
Scenario one.
Is continue with our current debt service and not refinance.
Right.
Okay. And that's my recommendation, is we continue and pay it off, and it's done in 3 years, Mike?
2020 would be the last payment.
2020, last payment. If we refinanced, we'd go 10 years from now?
Well, if we refinance and reissue new bonds, we can only go one additional year. If we refinance internally, there's a number of different options that I outlined.
So if we refinance and would go one additional year, so that would be 2021.
Right.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, you're the finance guy of this of our group. We always seem to follow your lead. I really think we're in decent shape as a course, in spite of some bad publicity. I really believe that we're in fairly decent shape. Revenues could be stronger, but we're weather related, and I really believe that the sooner we pay down that debt, the better off we'll be. And I'm not a proponent of refinancing. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'm looking for your opinion at some point, please. Thank you.
Councilor Turco.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would concur with Councilor Gould. I think we stay the course and pay the last three payments and be done with this once and for all. In reference to Councilor McGinn's comment on document number 3, I mean, if we get to that point and we needed to address it, I would. I'm not in favor of that right now. Adding more to the debt, I'd rather just attempt to make some of the changes that Councilor Sinowitz and other councils had suggested, and see how those changes transpire. And if we do need to do that down the road, I would consider it. But anyway, I would be more inclined to pay the last 3 payments and move on.
Any other councilors have go ahead, Councilman McGinn?
Thank you, Mr. President. Through you to Councilor Turco. Just to be clear, I agree. I don't see any pressing need to take any of these actions at this moment in time. The third option is just there as a contingency if we chose to do it later. We just know we have that in our back pocket should we need to exercise that at a later date. I am definitely not advocating that we pursue that at this moment in time. We don't have another payment due on the debt service until June, right?
Actually, July.
July. So we have several months before we even need to really take any definitive action.
Any other comments, Council Walsh? No?
None other than I concur with my fellow councilors.
So the issue, my opinion is the issue was brought up because we were treating the debt payment like it's a P&L activity, but it's not. It's actually a balance sheet item. It's cash. It's an asset, and we have a liability. And so we're generating actually enough cash to pay down the liability. So when does it make sense to use another asset that you have? It makes sense if the cost of the liability is higher than the return on the asset that you're investing, right? So a perfect example is if I'm spending 4% to keep a loan out there and borrow, and I'm earning 1%, the potential gain from paying off the loan early is the difference. So there is an argument that could be made that you don't want to carry that debt if it's 4% when you have underutilized cash that's earning 1%, because there's actually a net savings for the city to do that. And we've done that before. We paid down a number of higher interest bonds in the past with cash because we were going to save the interest on the bonds, on the notes themselves, right? And I would concur with Council McGinn only if the city had a liquidity problem. So you had a marginal reserve that didn't suffice for any emergencies, and you were in need of that cash for potential emergencies. But in a situation where you have $15 million in cash, even after what we drew, then to deploy cash to offset interest expense is almost, from a financial perspective, is almost a good use of that money. That being said, your argument is that, and it's right, there really is no pressing need. I mean, the golf course isn't going to default on a payment on the bond. So having the third option available there is, if they got in a hole, we could draw the cash and do it. To Council McGinn's point, but and one point of disagreement is that if you set this up as a loan from the city to the golf course, all you're doing is you're transitioning the asset from cash to a loan receivable. It's still an asset, so it still becomes, and if there's an obligation, it's still an obligation that has to be paid. So a lot depends on how you want to look at it. There was no pressing need. I didn't see it at the time, but I certainly would not advocate for 1 minute that we go out and borrow at 3.5% and incur the cost of issuing the bond for any purpose, that would be, to me, foolish. So the only two things that would make sense to me is leave it alone, or use the reserves and set up a note receivable for the city, which is a part of its assets, and pay off the higher interest bonds. But the gap may not be enough to make it worth its while. So I would say I'm not uncomfortable with either one of those, but I would never vote to support going out and issuing a new bond. That would be not a good thing to do.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
Mr. Chairman, do you need a motion to continue the current schedule, or do we, what's the right way procedurally now?
Do you want to just leave this in committee and revisit it in the future?
I think you can just leave it in committee, and that way, there's, no action is an action right
Okay,
now.
okay.
It keeps the status quo.
All right.
And we just leave it in committee, and we'll review it again in 6 months, and if it looks like the golf course is in any need of additional capital, then we can look at either lending it money, or we can look at, giving it money on a contingency basis. On a motion, all in favor, any opposed, it's vote.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you. Thank you, councilors.
Thank you, Mike. Appreciate the work. It was good analysis, by the way. Thank you.
Thank you.
Next item on the agenda is, I believe, the issue of a discussion of the purchase and sale agreement for 10 Lowell Street. Mr. Mayor.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good evening, councilors. I believe many of you know the history of this site very well. You're very familiar with the site. I think some of you might have visited Brody's at one point or another. September of 2013, we purchased the one half of the building. It was called 16 Lowell Street. We purchased that half of the building from the Codaires, demolished it to create some open space. The hope would always be that we'd be able to, at some point, if it made sense and it was the right time for the city, to purchase 10 Lowell Street and do the same thing. Take that property, demolish it, clear it out for open space, maybe do some flood mitigation work, which I think, as all of you know, when we've had flooding issues in the past, that has been an area that has struggled and received significant flood damage. And that opportunity has presented itself now. The current owners of the property are Northfield Group. It was part of the portfolio that they purchased a couple of years ago from Arthur Gordon and his family. They have that property, and they've expressed a strong interest or a strong intention to sell the property this winter. They do have it with a broker to be sold. However, we've had a handshake agreement in place that when time came that the city would be interested in that property for the purposes of our use. I would ask for approval to sign a purchase and sale agreement to allow for the purchase of that property, and to my feeling that that property could be great to continue kind of the efforts we've made to beautify the area. My feeling is that that building is an eyesore. It does not fit in with really the character of the neighborhood, this area. It sticks out to me as an eyesore, and I think demolishing that building, having open space for that property, potentially even a little bit of parking on the other side, maybe an extension of our municipal lot over there, would be something that would be possible. We've talked about the George Peabody statue. I think that would be an excellent location for the George Peabody statue, and we could do some flood mitigation work in that area and really beautify that spot. We've had, as you know, and I know many of you have come to our pop-up pubs that we've had downtown, and we think that area could be a nice space for people to gather and enjoy the community and enjoy certain events, community events that we have downtown. With the Brodies moving over to that location, that is now finalized. The construction on that building will be starting shortly. In fact, we're planning to do some sort of groundbreaking and wall breaking event here within the next week or two. I'll be notifying you of. And also now with the Next Mex Thing being relocated over on Main Street across from the Peabody Library. So that would be the two businesses that are existing at that location. So they would stay in business until they were ready to move over to their current, or to their new location. It's estimated that Brody's would be ready to go hopefully in September, next September. And the next thing I know is hoping to get in much earlier than that. So we, if we were to move forward with the purchase, we're looking at a February date. We would be the landlord for a period of time. And then once the two restaurants move out, we would move forward with the demolition of the property, again, to have that open space, which I think would be terrific for this area. Again, I think the merits of this action are many. Continue the beautification effort, take away an eyesore of a building, do some flood mitigation work to continue the fine work that I think we've done as a community to increase property values, to take away some of the flood concerns that we've had over the years, and just, again, create some more open space and beautification, which I think would be great. The proceeds from the sale, and Sean Farrell is on his way. He just sent me a picture of himself caught in traffic. He's one of the representatives of Northfield. Norman Lee and Jim Gibo are the other two. He would be here today, and he's on his way. He'll just be here late. He would tell you that his intention is to take those proceeds, the $425,000, and put it immediately into the existing properties that they own. There's a couple of places that they're identified as their next projects, and money would be put back in to those buildings. So it would be an investment. That money would be an investment back into the city of Peabody. We would lose about $8,000 in property taxes. We do get $8,000, approximately $8,000 from that building. So that would be a loss. However, I do think that the continued work we've done has significantly increased the property values in that area. Just to give you kind of a sense, with the Brody's building, Pat Tedisco, we've been getting approximately $25,000 from that building for taxes. When Brody's is in and when those new residential units are built, we're estimating that would triple, almost triple in value. So I think the investments we've made would offset some of that loss of that $8,000. But I'd be happy to answer any questions. Kurt Bellavance is here from Community Development. The funding would be two areas for funding. We've already been approved by Community Preservation for $175,000. The additional funds to effectuate the transaction would be from, we have an account that is for sale and purchase of residential property. Mr. Gingras is here, certainly answer any questions about that. That's the money we used 4 years ago when we purchased the Coderre building, was money from that fund. And I would submit that we take the money for to finish this deal at that time. Happy to answer any questions, Mr. Chairman.
Council Gould.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mayor. Mayor, if you would, please. The current empty lot abuts the Murphy family property. The empty lot, how will we differentiate? Will there be some kind of fence that will go between the empty lot and Murphy's, and will that then leave the rest of that as open area?
Yeah, I think that's a good idea, and I'd be all for that, putting a fence up to delineate the property lines. We're targeting kind of this George Peabody statue for that area, and I think probably putting a fence up would be the right decision. The Murphys own the whole parking lot. That property is theirs. We just own that building itself.
And Mayor, if you would, any thoughts of mitigation at all? Any, in what particular flood mitigation, I should say? Any ideas?
We would certainly, I think, need to get some expertise from our engineers and maybe even hire a consultant to come in to evaluate. But I'm told that there's some improvements that we can make that could definitely help our ability to hold water and to store water.
I think that would be a fabulous asset for that particular block, so I think that you're onto something there.
Thank you.
So thank you.
So, Council Walsh.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mayor, just a couple quick questions. The first, just to make sure, while the city of Peabody is landlord, is there any additional liability insurance we have to purchase because we're a landlord to an establishment that has, that's serving liquor? Do we have any extended obligations there or liability?
No, good question. That was something we looked into very early on, because we would be a landlord to a restaurant that has liquor, well, at least one has a liquor license. The next thing does not. No, we do not need, it would be covered under our general policy, general liability policy. Salem is a landlord to a number of restaurants, and they have liquor licenses kind of on their artist row over in that area. So that's something we checked with them as well. So, no, we wouldn't need additional coverage.
Just a couple other quick ones. The account with the property sale, some of the money is coming from, what's the official name here is receipts reserved for the sale of real estate. Is, in that separate account, is there more than $250,000 in that account?
There's over 500,000 in there. We received 370,000 from the sale of the 114 property, off of 114, for the car parking area.
One.
Route 1.
Yep, okay. No, I was pleased to see that, only because, you know, there has been an emphasis over the last several years where we have purchased several properties. And what I would like to see, and maybe, you know, it doesn't have to be here, but I would like to see some emphasis on some lots that we have, a couple buildings, as a matter of fact, that, you know, I know you have been moving forward trying to relinquish these properties, but I think it would be helpful if, over the course of the next year, there was an emphasis on some of the properties that the city owns that maybe we don't need anymore, and see if we can push them so that we offset the tax dollars that we'll lose in property tax from this building by selling off and bringing those properties back onto the tax rolls and other places in the city. I think that'd be helpful. And just one last thing, Mayor, if you don't mind, Mr. Chairman, is, what was it? I forgot what it was. I better get off this council.
Is that mean I'm going to be running a birthday party for you, too? You're starting to lose a little bit of the... Okay. Got it.
Never mind, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I forgot what, no, I'm just kidding, Tom. The $10,000 for legal fees, I see why, you know, you're $10,000 above the asking for that, but why didn't we go a bit further? Because I see, I mean, what's the demo must be substantial in the wetlands area.
Yep.
So I'm just wondering if we have an estimate on what the demo of that building is going to cost, and B, we spoke about fences and possible paving, and I'm just wondering, can we take that from the sale of real estate? And I should have prefaced this with, I like the idea. I think this is a great idea for the downtown to just add to what's already been done. Just those questions.
Okay. Thank you. Good question. So we felt we just took an estimate as to some of the closing costs. We probably have extra in there than we need. So I think maybe holding that money for a fence or for some other improvements or maintenance for the property will be, I think that's a good idea. When we purchased the other half, the 16 Lowell Street, the Codair building, we got the funding for the demolition from MEMA because it's in a flood zone. So our intention is to try to get that money again to do the same thing. So we haven't included any money for the demolition. We're confident that we'd be able to get the grant money because that is in a flood, identified flood area, that we'd be able to utilize that same source again. If not, then certainly that would be something I may have to come back to you on, but I feel pretty confident that we'd be able to do that again.
Thank you.
Councilor Walsh's short-term memory lapse has returned, so there you go, Councilor Walsh.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Very emotional. As I understand it, Mayor, the idea is to keep this property as open space. Is there any any possibility of it being developed, or should we include in the deed that it remains open space?
Another good question. We did purchase the community preservation when we sought the funds from community preservation. It was under the open space. They're allowed to fund projects, open space, historical renovation, historical and affordable housing. So it was purchased under open space. So there's obligations on us to do that. I certainly have no problem putting that as a restriction on a deed. To me, this is all about open space and doing the flood mitigation work and beautification. So I would not have a problem doing that.
No, I appreciate that, because again, I think, I agree with Councilor Turco, and I would suspect everybody that it really is going to change the look of Peabody Square when that building is not there. And just the sight lines from every corner, you'll be able to see City Hall from Central Street. I just think it's a terrific project, and it is going to enhance the value, as you stated, of all the surrounding properties. It's a great thing for the city.
Thank you.
Council Turco, I saw your hand, but try to write it down so you don't forget, and then Council McGinn will relinquish the floor after.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think the mayor has done an excellent job articulating the case for this. I'm not going to restate the points he made, just to say that I am in full support of this. On the financial side, I think the loss of property taxes will be more than, it's going to be replenished by orders of magnitude by the increase in the property values just in that one main property alone. I think we're going to see more than a offset. So this should not be revenue neutral. This should be beneficial in the long term. Just from a procedural standpoint, we have item 7B in the main meeting package related to this. I'd like to move to receive that and refer to this matter. So move.
On the motion, all in favor, any opposed? Let's vote.
And I just want to be clear, I think there are two actions necessary this evening, the transfer request as well as the approval of the for the mayor to enter into a P&S negotiation. Is that correct? Thank you, Mr. So I'll be after Mr. Turco. Councilor Turco has his opportunity, or other councilors, I'd be happy to make those motions. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Now, Councilor Turco.
Mr. President, through you to Councilor Walsh and the mayor, I guess. My only concern with putting a deed restriction on is the mayor had mentioned possible parking, and I like that idea. I think we could use it. Does that restrict us if we put it to open space? Can it be questioned whether we can add additional parking spaces in that area if we do restrict ourselves? I don't want to see us handcuff ourselves if that becomes an issue.
We could potentially put it, that if we go that route, and I'd have to obviously talk to Attorney Smozinski, but we could put a deed restriction on for no structure. Because I do think that we might be able to get some additional parking on the one side, and I'd like to get some additional parking if we can. So maybe it would be, if we do go that route, but I'm actually just thinking, the deed, they have to do the deed. Well, that's something I think we could take out. I don't want to lose the ability to do parking. Yep.
Thank you.
I just have a couple of questions. Let me start off by saying that I am in favor of this as well, for a lot of reasons, not just the beautification reason, but that building is really, it just doesn't belong there. It's too close to the track. We've seen that when it got hit with the dumpster. It sits on top of the culvert. And one of my concerns is we can't get rid of the culvert, so the river run through it. So what are the plans to make sure that we protect it, particularly, the liability that you pick up if we don't do a good job of making sure people can't fall into that dirty river? you know, how are we going to protect it? I think it's going to require more than a little fence. So what are your thoughts on that?
I'm really open to any suggestions on that. I think there's, as I've been saying, you know, beautification we can do, but I also think there's some safety issues that we'd have to protect ourselves. So I really don't have a plan just yet, and I'd be open to any suggestions, but I think yours are right on.
It's certainly something that has to be put into consideration, because it is just a wide open area. When you take that other building off, you're going to have two sides that are wide open. It's not going to be a contiguous grassland. You're going to have a grassland over here where Codere was, and this new grassland, and in between we're going to have this jaggedy old culvert, which you've seen. It's, you know, it may even require that you fortify that, the riversides, to shore it up, because it's just been left there over the ages. And given that that was the main trench for disposal for the factories, I'm sure you don't want anybody trouncing along the bottom of that, at least if they want feet when they're done. It just is not a good idea. The other issue I had is and again, I'm 100% in favor of this, but I know when he bought those properties, this was like the dog that he got for the other things that he wanted, and I would dare say he would have a hard time getting $435,000 for this property from somebody who wants to put it into commercial use, particularly where it's had such a bad history of flooding. The basements are really unusable for storage, and the properties are in deplorable shape. It's almost like, is there an opportunity to look at that 435? If we can't get that number down, can we get more than a handshake commitment? Because, again, this is somebody that we know, and we've had a few commitments in the past that haven't come true from this person, that he would put that money into a particular building for a particular interest that the city has in terms of the economic development of the downtown. For instance, directly across the street, nobody wants the rooming house. Everybody wants a restaurant on that where the sports building is. You know, can we make the purchase and sale in such a way that he agrees to use the funds the way that we would think we want them to be used, and not just tell us what we want to hear? Yeah, we're going to reinvest in downtown, but you know what happens, and I hate to say it, is, you know, other bills get higher priority at some point in time because cash is king, and we end up with none of that money getting reinvested in the downtown. So is there a willingness on their part to put more than a handshake to it? Will they put it in writing that they're going to keep the money downtown and that they're going to invest it in a particular building versus spread it like, you know, thin layer of salt over the whole Main Street? I'm just curious.
Yep. Two things I wanted to say. First is, they have the property out right now for $549,000 with the Mega Group, and I tend to agree with you. I think that is overly optimistic for that property. But they claim to have done, and I haven't seen it, but they did an analysis, and that's what the broker came back at. I was hoping he was here, and I'm surprised he's not here yet, because he would speak to what their plan is. I do know that there's three properties that they're intending to utilize this money for. One is the location of the next thing. Second is the location of the brewery. And then the third is the building that you're referencing that, you know, to me is the next building to do over at Sports Collectibles, that Allen block. So I think they would be willing to sign an agreement to that. You know, the enforceability of it would be a little bit tricky, but I think they would be willing to do that. I can say that the other option would be to potentially, and I think they would be agreeable to this, is to the property was purchased for approximately, I think it was 8.3 million. They got a loan from the city for 1.8 million. Property now being 425, that there could be a percentage based on the numbers that they could pay back. You'd take some of that money and pay back some of the loan if we wanted to go that route as well. So, you know, we'd have to work out the numbers, but, the fact that they're willing, and he said he'd be willing to testify here, again, this isn't under oath, but he'd be willing to testify in front of the city that that's where the money was going, made me feel good. But I do think they would be willing to sign an agreement to that.
I mean, and I appreciate he's willing to come here. With all his best effort, he wants to keep it in the city. I get it, but he's got himself spread out there pretty good. He's doing some work in Beverly, and I'll be honest with you. You know, when I put my building on the market on Main Street, the broker told me one thing too. You know, they said 900,000, should be able to get 900,000, 26 parking spaces, 7,200 square feet, contiguous building, new utility, on and on and on. The gentleman in question, when he saw it on the market, come running over, and he says it isn't worth 600,000. So, I mean, to me, yeah, I get it. You know, he wants to use the broker when it's good for him in terms of his value, but I would tell you, if 49 Lowell Street sat on the market for 5 years, which it did, and it's still having trouble, they just sold it, I think, but they're still having trouble selling it, I'm just having a hard time believing that they're going to find somebody to come in and pay $500,000 for a building that floods underneath it, that has no tenants left in it, and that, you know, basically has no parking and, you know, abuts a canal. It doesn't seem like, you know, the businessman's idea of a dream come true. So, I like your idea of maybe taking the money and having them reduce the city's debt, and we'd be getting all the money back to ourselves. That'd be a great idea. Yep. But I just want something in writing that will basically say, hey, we recognize you're giving us a great deal here, and because of that, we're willing to commit this deal back to the city, and it gets the effect, I think, that you want. That's my point.
Thank you.
Any further comments? Sorry, I had to get that off my chest. Being none, I'll take your motions, Councilman McGinn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Move to approve the transfer of $185,000 from Community Preservation Act Open Space to the Community Preservation Act 10 Lowell Street in the same amount, $185,000. So moved.
You've heard the motion by Council McGinn. On the motion, roll call.
Councilors Turco,
Yes.
Gould,
Yes.
McGinn,
Yes.
Walsh, Gravel.
Yes.
Motion carries 5-0.
Council McGinn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to approve the transfer of $250,000 from the receipts reserved from sale of real estate account to the account for acquisition of 10 Lowell Street in the same amount of $250,000. So moved.
On the motion by Council McGinn. Comments? Being none, roll call.
Councilors Turco,
Yes.
Gould,
Yes.
McGinn,
Yes.
Walsh.
Yes.
Gravel.
We're all getting used to our new buttons. Yes.
Motion carries 5-0.
Council McGinn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Move to authorize His Honor the Mayor to execute a purchase and sale agreement for the property and building located at 10 Lowell Street, Peabody. So moved.
Council McGinn, can I add to your motion on that?
Right ahead.
With the request that the purchase and sale include language indicative of the seller reinvesting the money in the downtown. So, there you go. Council Walsh.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Could we also include language that it would be included in the deed that no commercial or residential structure would be constructed on that lot?
Yeah. Council McGinn is thinking of all these great things. Thanks, Council McGinn. Any further comments on the motion?
So that motion as, with the additional adds from Councilor Gravel, Councilor Walsh, so moved.
On the motion, comments, none, roll call?
Councilors Turco,
Yes.
Gould,
Yes.
Yes.
Walsh,
Yes.
Gravel.
Yes.
Motion carries 5-0.
I'll accept
Thank
the-
you, Council, and I just want to say, I really do believe this purchase and this demolition, I think we're going to be stunned and people will be shocked by how this is going to change the look of the downtown. I think this is going to be transformational in many ways, so thank you for the support.
I'll accept the motion to adjourn.
To adjourn.